Today we're back in Gary W. Jenkins' book, Calvin's Tormentors, and we approach chapter 9, which is entitled Joachim Westphal, Calvin the Reluctant Zuricher. This chapter plunges us into the second Eucharistic controversy, which was a fierce theological clash over the Lord's Supper that not only tested Calvin's theology, but according to Jenkins, revealed his limits as a peacemaker. Jenkins begins by setting the stage. I'll overlay a map here of Reformation Europe with the highlights on Zurich, Geneva, Wittenberg, and Hamburg. So the stage was set in late 1540s. This is after Emperor Charles V's victory at Mühlberg in 1547. The Protestant cause was in a fragile position. The concern was if Charles was to invade and take Strasbourg, then the Swiss Empire would fall shortly thereafter. So Calvin feared that a divided Protestant front would collapse under that sort of imperial pressure. So his solution, forge unity with Zurich through a doctrinal agreement. This was the challenge. And the result, of course, was the Consensus Tigurinus, which was finalized in September of 1549. The Consensus Tigurinus. The consensus brought Geneva and Zurich closer together, but it came at a cost. Calvin had to make compromises where he wasn't comfortable with, but in its initial drafting, Calvin had included language that qualified much of his conviction and where it would have distinguished from Bucer, for instance. But when the Consensus Tigurinus was published, that was all removed. So Calvin was forced to drop some of his strongest language about the sacraments. So phrases like instruments of grace had to be removed in order to secure that compromise. Again, with the intention of uniting the Swiss reformers. So as a move that, according to Jenkins, stripped out Calvin's distinctive Eucharistic theology, and of course that left room for his critics to question his convictions. Which introduces us to Joachim Westphal. Joachim Westphal. Joachim was born in Hamburg in 1510 and was a dedicated Gnesio-Lutheran. A Gnesio-Lutheran, in contrast to a Philippist, is allegedly one that is more faithful to the teachings of Luther than the perceived modifications later by Melanchthon. So Westphal saw himself as a true Lutheran who was fiercely opposed to any compromise with those in the Reformed tradition. He was trained both under Luther and Melanchthon in Wittenberg, and Westphal became eventually minister at St. Catherine's in Hamburg, and then eventually went on to become the superintendent there. So for Westphal, the Consensus Tigurinus was nothing less than a betrayal of Lutheran sacramental doctrine. Westphal's earlier works began with his attack in a text called the Farrago, which was published in 1552, which is a compilation of contradictory Reformed statements about Christ's presence in the supper. This was an easy target because, if you recall, just alluded to, Calvin had made a number of compromises in the Consensus Tigurinus, and so it was not a difficult task for Westphal to see some inconsistencies within the Reformed tradition. So he had included there excerpts from Calvin himself. And what was Westphal's aim? It was to show the theological confusion of the so-called sacramentarians. So in 1553, he followed with a book called Recta Fides, or Recta Fides de Sene Domini. It was an exegetical commentary on 1 Corinthians 11. That was obviously the exegetical war ground, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, because it's there where Westphal zeroed in on the words of institution, which was, "This is my body." And Westphal was insisting that the resurrected body of Christ is truly given in the Eucharist, and that anything less than this conviction, he charged, was a spiritual phantasm of the Zwinglians. Westphal rejected the Reformed practice of merely reciting Paul's account of the supper without a prayer of consecration. And he was accusing them, the reformers, of leaving the elements untouched by divine action. He argued that the Lord's Supper actually confects salvation itself, bound to the words of institution. So for him and those in his tradition, there was no Christ apart from his flesh and blood, and no benefit apart from that life-giving body. So while Westphal initially didn't target Calvin personally, Calvin couldn't ignore the attack. Once others, like our good Polish friend and reformer Jan Waski, or sometimes transliterated into the Latin as John A. Lasko, Jan Waski, or I'm sorry, Jan, not Juan, it's Jan Waski is the pronunciation there. He brought this to Calvin's attention. So in 1555, Calvin responded with his Defensio Sanae Orthodoxae Doctrinae de Sacramentis, which was a short treatise. The title wouldn't have indicated that, but it was a short treatise written on behalf of all of the Swiss. He even sent a copy to Melanchthon, hoping to at least win over Melanchthon, or at least find common ground. But Melanchthon, who had a bunch of things going on in his own world, stayed silent and didn't provide a response. That silence was interpreted to have spoken volumes. So Westphal fires back with his Defensio Lusta in 1555, now directly attacking Calvin and pitting his statements against those of other Reformed leaders. Calvin's reply, the Secunda Defensio, which is his second defense, 1556, was Jenkins describes as fiery and passionate, but Jenkins uses the expression that it was vitriolic and tone deaf, and he believed it alienated more than it persuaded. Now this is Jenkins' conclusion. If you, for instance, Philip Schaff, you can find his work on ccel.org. Schaff's conclusion was that Calvin's response was absolutely devastating for the Lutherans. So we would be best to read these texts ourselves, these primary texts, and come to some sort of conclusion from those. But the controversy from here snowballed. Other Lutherans like Matthias Flacius Elicrius, if I'm pronouncing that right, he rallied to Westphal's side. The Reformed also responded, with Bullinger and Bernardino Ochino defending their side. But Bullinger warned Calvin that he had underestimated the opposition, and I think that's true. He underestimated Westphal's capacity. By 1557, Calvin was pressing for a Protestant conference to sort of heal the rift. But Melanchthon openly denounced the Swiss at Worms that autumn. Of course, that doesn't help anything. And Calvin, still trying to shield his friend, called it the outburst of a tired old man. If you recall, Luther loved Melanchthon, and he loved Luther as well. Luther, of course, it wasn't reciprocal. Melanchthon did have affections for Calvin, but Melanchthon was much older than Calvin, and so Calvin excuses much of this as attributed to his age. Calvin's last contribution to the dispute was his Ultima Admonitio in 1557. Westphal answered with two more tracts in 1558, his Apologia and his Confutatio, which Jenkins describes as in excess of 150 pages. Westphal wanted to keep the battle going. Of course, Calvin disengaged at that point. In the end, Jenkins concludes Calvin lost this round. That's Jenkins' conclusion, and Jenkins is writing within the Reformed tradition. Jenkins believes Westphal had skillfully used Calvin's own words to expose what he saw as inconsistencies, which there were inconsistencies because Calvin had, in many ways, was inconsistent with Bucer and Bullinger. So in this sense, Westphal was successful in driving a wedge between Zurich and Geneva, which was clearly his intention. Calvin's concessions had neither secured peace nor preserved his original theological stance. This chapter reveals a Calvin caught between two worlds, Zurich's symbolic reading of the supper and Wittenberg's insistence on the real presence. His desire for unity led him to compromise language he had once championed, leaving him isolated from both sides. Jenkins' portrait of Westphal is of a determined and effective opponent, One of the few who could, in his estimation, outmaneuver Calvin in theological polemic. Again, I'll leave that for you to decide. Perhaps we'll work through those books at some point in the future. But for today, that's chapter 9 of Calvin's Tormentors, Joachim Westphal. The second Eucharistic controversy was more than just a doctrinal spat. It was a test of alliances. It was a test of rhetoric and of theological resolve. So that's it for chapter 9. Join me next time as we look at the next of Calvin's formidable opponents. And remember, sometimes in trying to make peace, you can end up with more enemies than you started with. Until next time.